A runway maintenance worker discovered human hands growing from the tarmac at Black Ridge International Airport. But what began as a horrifying discovery quickly became something far more sinister. The disembodied hands were moving in precise patterns, mimicking the exact motions of cockpit controls. 27-year veteran air traffic controller Martin Reeves was the first official to document the phenomenon, stating that in his nearly 3 decades of service, he had never encountered anything that defied explanation quite like this. The incident occurred on March 17, 2023, during routine maintenance of runway 27L at Black Ridge International, a mid-sized airport serving approximately 2 million passengers annually. The facility sits on what was once marshland, drained and developed in the late 1970s, despite protests from environmental groups who claimed the area had historical significance to indigenous communities. These protests would later take on an unsettling new dimension in light of what was discovered there. Luis Morales, a 54-year-old runway maintenance technician with 18 years of experience, arrived at 3:15 in the morning to repair minor surface cracks that had been reported by pilots during the previous day's operations. The airport was under minimum staffing during these hours, with only essential personnel present and no scheduled flights until 6:25 a.m. Morales was alone on the tarmac, working approximately 2,000 feet from the main terminal building when he first noticed something unusual about the surface he was repairing. "I was patching a series of stress fractures near the touchdown zone," Morales later stated in his official report. The cracks weren't particularly deep, maybe half an inch, but they seemed to be arranged in an unusual pattern, almost like fingers spreading out from a central point. He initially dismissed this observation as coincidental, attributing it to his fatigue after working a double shift. But as he applied the bituminous sealant to the damaged area, he noticed that the material wasn't adhering properly to the surface. Instead of filling the cracks, the sealant appeared to be pushed back up, as if something beneath the tarmac was rejecting it. Morales bent down to examine the anomaly more closely, using his industrial flashlight to illuminate the area. What he saw in that moment would forever alter his perception of reality. "At first, I thought it was just the reflection of my gloves on the wet sealant," he recalled, his voice trembling during his later interview with airport security. "But then I realized the shapes were moving independently of my hands. They were pale, almost bluish, and they were pushing through the cracks in the runway." What Morales initially mistook for a trick of the light was, in fact, human fingers slowly emerging through the fractured tarmac. As he watched in horror, the fingers extended further, followed by palms and wrists, until 2 complete human hands had broken through the surface of the runway. The hands were male, with prominent veins and weathered skin, consistent with someone in their late 50s or early 60s. They bore no signs of trauma or decomposition that would be expected if they belonged to a body buried beneath the runway. Most disturbing of all, the hands were moving. Not random twitches or the natural settling of recently deceased tissue, but deliberate, coordinated movements. The right hand repeatedly extended its thumb and index finger in a pinching motion, while the left hand rotated at the wrist as if turning an invisible dial. These movements continued with mechanical precision, repeating the same sequence every 47 seconds. Morales immediately contacted airport security via his radio. "I need someone at runway 27L immediately," he reported. There's something wrong with the tarmac." When pressed for details, Morales struggled to articulate what he was witnessing. "Just send someone," he insisted. "You need to see this for yourselves." Security Supervisor Diane Kelly arrived at the scene 12 minutes later, accompanied by 2 officers. By this time, the hands had emerged further from the runway surface, revealing wrists adorned with what appeared to be the cuff of a white shirt and the partial sleeve of a dark blue jacket. Kelly's body camera captured approximately 90 seconds of footage before the device inexplicably malfunctioned, showing the hands continuing their rhythmic movements against the dark backdrop of the pre-dawn tarmac. "My first thought was that this was some kind of prank," Kelly stated. "Maybe a maintenance worker had buried a mechanical prop under a thin layer of asphalt during previous repairs, but when we tried to touch the hands, They were warm. They had pulse points. These were human tissues, somehow alive, despite being separated from a body and embedded in solid concrete. Kelly immediately escalated the situation, contacting both airport management and local police. The section of runway was cordoned off, and all arriving flights were redirected to the parallel runway 27R. By 5:45 a.m., a perimeter had been established around the site, and Airport Operations Director Harold Weiss had arrived to assess the situation. Weiss, a former Air Force colonel with a background in aviation safety, initially suspected some kind of elaborate hoax or terrorist threat. He ordered ground-penetrating radar to be brought to the site to determine if an explosive device or other dangerous materials might be buried beneath the runway. While waiting for the equipment to arrive, he instructed the small gathered team not to touch or disturb the protruding hands. As the sun began to rise over Black Ridge International, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Air Traffic Controller Martin Reeves noticed something that would add another layer of inexplicable horror to the unfolding situation. "I was watching the hands through binoculars from the tower," Reeves reported, "and I realized I recognized the movements they were making. They weren't random at all. They were executing the exact sequence a pilot would use to prepare for an emergency descent." Reeves, who had been a commercial pilot for 15 years before transitioning to air traffic control, was intimately familiar with cockpit procedures. What he observed was a textbook emergency response, the right hand adjusting the throttle and fuel mixture, while the left hand set the transponder to the international distress code. The movements were being performed with perfect technique, exactly as they would be taught in flight school. By 8:17 a.m., the ground-penetrating radar had arrived and was being calibrated for use on the tarmac. Meanwhile, the hands had continued their movements without interruption, completing the emergency descent sequence more than 20 times. Airport officials debated whether to attempt to extract the hands from the runway, but concerns about structural integrity, as well as the unprecedented nature of the situation, led to a decision to observe and document before taking any direct action. The radar operator, Terry Simmons, began scanning the area beneath and around the protruding hands. The initial readings were confusing and inconsistent. According to the equipment, there was no cavity or foreign object below the tarmac, only solid layers of asphalt, concrete, and compacted soil. And yet, the hands continued to move, emerging from what should have been impenetrable material. "It doesn't make any sense," Simmons told Weiss as they reviewed the radar data. "According to this, those hands shouldn't be there. There's no void, no body, no opening in the runway structure at all. It's as if they're phasing through solid matter." At 9:05 a.m., a specialized team from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived, having been informed that there was a biological anomaly on the runway that might relate to aviation safety. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the team's forensic pathologist, conducted a preliminary examination of the hands without removing them from the tarmac. "These are the hands of a Caucasian male, approximately 55 to 65 years of age," she noted in her report. "The skin shows signs of regular sun exposure consistent with an individual who spends significant time at high altitudes where UV radiation is more intense. There are calluses on the fingertips that match patterns commonly seen in career pilots. Most notably, the right hand bears a small scar on the middle finger that is consistent with a minor burn, possibly from a hot cockpit instrument." Dr. Chen attempted to take a tissue sample for DNA analysis but encountered unexpected resistance. When she tried to cut a small section of skin from the back of the right hand, her scalpel blade snapped. A second attempt with a fresh blade yielded the same result. The hands, despite their apparent human composition, were somehow hardened to the point of being virtually impenetrable. By mid-morning, word of the discovery had begun to spread among airport staff despite management's efforts to contain information about the situation. A small crowd of off-duty personnel had gathered at the perimeter, watching as the investigation continued. Rumors circulated rapidly, with theories ranging from a movie special effect gone wrong to a terrorist plot involving biological weapons. Then, at 11:23 a.m., something changed. The hands, which had been repeating the emergency descent sequence for over 8 hours, suddenly shifted to a new pattern of movement. The left hand flattened, palm down, while the right formed a fist. Then, using what appeared to be tremendous force, the right hand began to pound against the tarmac surface. The impacts created no sound, but small cracks began to radiate outward from the point of contact. The left hand, meanwhile, had begun to trace letters onto the runway surface, leaving faint white marks as if writing with chalk. Those present watched in stunned silence as the hand slowly spelled out a message. Flight 2337. Flight 2337. The designation immediately sent a chill through Harold Weiss, who had been monitoring the situation continuously since his arrival. Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 2337 had disappeared from radar over the Pacific Ocean 17 years earlier, in March 2006. The Boeing 767, carrying 214 passengers and crew, had vanished without a trace approximately 3 hours into its journey from Los Angeles to Tokyo. Despite one of the most extensive search operations in aviation history, no wreckage had ever been found, and the disappearance remained one of the industry's most baffling mysteries. Now, somehow, a message referencing that precise flight was being carved into the runway by a pair of disembodied hands. Weiss immediately contacted the FAA and ordered all records related to Flight 3337 to be sent to Black Ridge International. As this was happening, the hands had returned to their original movement pattern, once again executing the emergency descent procedure with mechanical precision. By early afternoon, the site had been further secured. A temporary structure had been erected around the area to shield it from view, and additional security personnel had been stationed to prevent unauthorized access. Airport management issued a statement that runway 27L was temporarily closed due to structural maintenance issues, and all flights were being directed to alternate runways without significant disruption to the schedule. Inside the temporary structure, Dr. Chen continued her examination of the phenomenon. Using specialized equipment, she was able to monitor the hands for electrical activity, similar to how an electroencephalogram records brain function. The results were astonishing. The hands were generating electrical patterns identical to those that would be produced by the motor cortex of a human brain during conscious, deliberate movement. These hands aren't just moving, Dr. Chen explained to the assembled team. They're being controlled by neurological signals. But the source of those signals isn't here. It's as if they're receiving instructions from somewhere else. At 4:17 p.m., 17 hours since the discovery, the FAA files on Flight 2337 arrived. Weiss and a small team of investigators began reviewing the materials, searching for any connection that might explain the current phenomenon. The captain of the ill-fated flight had been Gerald Kaufman, a 58-year-old veteran pilot with over 22,000 flight hours and impeccable safety record. His co-pilot had been First Officer Melissa Chang, 34, who had been with Trans-Pacific for 6 years at the time of the disappearance. As they reviewed Kaufman's personnel file, one detail caught Weiss's attention: a small notation in the pilot's medical record about a burn scar on his right middle finger, sustained during a cockpit incident in 2001. The description matched exactly the scar Dr. Chen had observed on the right hand protruding from the tarmac. "My God," Weiss whispered, "these are Kaufman's hands." How the hands of a pilot who had presumably died over the Pacific Ocean 17 years earlier had come to emerge from a runway thousands miles away was beyond comprehension. But the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The hands bore Captain Kaufman's distinctive scar, they were executing proper emergency protocols, and they had spelled out the flight number of the aircraft he had been piloting when he disappeared. As the investigation team grappled with this revelation, runway technician Morales, who had remained at the site throughout the day despite being offered relief, noticed another change in the hands' behavior. They had ceased their emergency descent sequence and were now moving in a new pattern, one that Reeves, the air traffic controller, recognized immediately. "They're going through the ditching procedure," Reeves said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the sequence for preparing to land on water, when the engines have failed and there's no other option." The team watched in silence as the hands methodically executed every step of the water landing protocol. The right hand adjusted imaginary throttles to idle position, while the left disengaged autopilot systems and adjusted flaps for maximum lift at low speed. The movements were performed with the calm precision of a pilot with thousands of hours of experience, a pilot like Gerald Kaufman. At 6:42 p.m., the hands once again paused their routine. The left hand flattened against the tarmac, while the right began to tap in a distinct pattern, not random, but the structured dots and dashes of Morse code. Reeves, who had maintained Morse proficiency throughout his career, translated the message in real time. NOTANACCIDENT. The implications of this message sent a wave of unease through those present. If Flight 2337 had not been lost due to an accident, what had caused its disappearance? Before anyone could process this question fully, the hands resumed their transmission. THEREINT in the clouds. Who is they? Weiss asked, though he knew no one present could answer. And what clouds? Where? The Morse code continued, growing more urgent in its pacing. SIXMILESUPUP and waiting. By nightfall, the situation at Black Ridge International had escalated significantly. Representatives from the FBI had arrived, along with additional specialists from the NTSB and FAA. The temporary structure around the site had been enhanced with sophisticated monitoring equipment, and armed guards now patrolled the perimeter. No photographs or recordings were permitted, and all personnel involved were required to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. The hands continued their activities throughout the night, alternating between flight procedures and Morse code messages. Each message was cryptic, but seemed to suggest that Flight 2337 had encountered something unexplainable during its journey, something that existed at high altitude and had somehow intercepted the aircraft. FOUND US in STORM. NOTHUMAN. THEYTAKPISLOTSFIRST. By dawn of the second day, the hands had been actively moving for more than 24 hours, with no signs of slowing or fatigue. Dr. Chen's continuous monitoring had revealed no degradation in the tissue, despite the hands being separated from any circulatory system that would normally provide oxygen and nutrients. The surrounding tarmac had developed a network of fine cracks extending outward from the emergence point, like a spider web reaching across the runway surface. At 7:15 a.m., as the morning's first flights were departing from the adjacent runway, the hands suddenly ceased all movement. For 17 minutes, they remained completely still, protruding from the tarmac in a neutral position. The investigators watched anxiously, uncertain whether the phenomenon was ending or merely shifting to a new phase. Then, without warning, both hands splayed their fingers wide and pressed firmly against the runway surface. Slowly, with visible effort, they began to push downward, as if trying to submerge back into the solid material from which they had emerged. "They're retreating," Dr. Chen observed. "Something's pulling them back in." The process was gradual but steady. Over the course of approximately 22 minutes, the hands descended back into the tarmac, disappearing millimeter by millimeter until only the fingertips remained visible. Then, in a final burst of activity, the right hand broke free long enough to tap out one last Morse message. RUNWAY 27L ISTHEIRDOO. With that, the fingertips slipped below the surface, leaving behind only the cracks and indentations that marked where they had been. The runway was empty once more, but the implications of what had transpired there would reverberate throughout the aviation community for years to come. In the immediate aftermath, Black Ridge International Airport completely resurfaced runway 27L, removing the entire top layer of tarmac and replacing it with fresh asphalt. The section where the hands had appeared was subjected to particularly thorough reconstruction, with the original material being removed to a depth of 3 feet and transported to an undisclosed federal facility for analysis. The official report on the incident, compiled jointly by the FAA, NTSB, and FBI, was classified at the highest level. Those who had witnessed the phenomenon firsthand were debriefed extensively and required to undergo psychological evaluations. Many, including Luis Morales, the maintenance technician who had made the initial discovery, requested transfers to different airports. Some left the aviation industry entirely. Martin Reeves, the air traffic controller who had recognized the flight patterns being executed by the hands, took early retirement 3 months after the incident. In a private journal later discovered by his daughter, he wrote, "What we saw at Black Ridge wasn't just a message from a lost pilot, it was a warning. Something is up there. Something that has learned to hide in the storms we fly through every day, and it's waiting for more of us to join the ones it's already taken." Trans-Pacific Airlines Flight 2337 remains officially listed as missing, presumed crashed due to unknown causes. The search for the aircraft was formally concluded in 2008, 2 years after its disappearance. But following the Black Ridge incident, a small covert operation was initiated by an unspecified government agency to re-examine weather patterns and radar anomalies associated with missing aircraft throughout aviation history. What they found has never been made public. Perhaps most disturbing of all are the reports that began to emerge from other airports in the months following the Black Ridge incident. Maintenance workers at facilities across North America reported unusual cracks forming in runway surfaces, often in patterns that resembled human fingers or hands. In each case, airport authorities quickly resurfaced the affected areas and dismissed the reports as coincidental damage caused by normal wear and stress. But pilots have noticed something else, something they rarely discuss outside the privacy of crew lounges and off-duty gatherings. When flying through storm clouds at high altitudes, particularly in the transoceanic routes that cross the Pacific, some have observed brief, unexplainable movements within the cloud formations. Shapes that almost resemble human figures, reaching out as the aircraft passes. The incidents are never reported officially. The pilots who witness them know that such reports would likely end their careers. Instead, they've developed their own protocol. If such a sighting occurs, they execute an immediate course correction, steering clear of the cloud formation regardless of the turbulence or fuel efficiency implications. Better to arrive late than to become another mysterious disappearance, another flight that vanishes without a trace. And at Black Ridge International, despite the extensive reconstruction, unusual things continue to happen on runway 27L. Pilots report brief radio static when taking off or landing there. Maintenance workers refuse to service that runway alone or after dark. And occasionally, when the weather is particularly stormy and the barometric pressure drops suddenly, those working in the control tower claim they can hear faint tapping sounds coming through their headsets. Tapping that, if one listens carefully, follows the rhythmic pattern of Morse code. The message is always the same: THERESTILLWAITING. Aviation authorities maintain that the Black Ridge incident was nothing more than mass hysteria triggered by fatigue and poor lighting conditions. The official explanation suggests that Luis Morales, working alone in the pre-dawn hours, mistook ordinary runway damage for something more sinister, and his report influenced others to see things that weren't really there. The classified nature of the investigation, they claim, was merely standard procedure for any potential security threat at a transportation facility. But those who were there know different. They saw Captain Kaufman's hands emerging from solid tarmac, executing perfect flight procedures, sending warnings from beyond. They know that something unprecedented occurred on that March morning, something that challenges our understanding of reality, of death, and of what might exist in the spaces between the worlds we know and those we have yet to discover. If you're flying tonight, perhaps it's best to request a route that avoids storm clouds. And if your pilot announces an unexpected course correction due to atmospheric conditions, be grateful rather than annoyed by the delay. It might just be the reason you reach your destination safely. And should you ever visit Black Ridge International Airport, pay attention as you taxi down runway 27L. Watch the tarmac carefully through your window. Some passengers have reported seeing unusual cracks in the surface, cracks that almost resemble the outline of human hands. According to maintenance records, that section of runway has been resurfaced 17 times in the past year, far more frequently than any other section at any airport in the country. The hands of Captain Gerald Kaufman may have retreated beneath the tarmac, but their warning remains. Something is waiting in the clouds, 6 miles up, something that takes pilots first. And runways like 27L might be more than just strips of asphalt designed for takeoffs and landings. They might be doors to somewhere else. Doors that, once opened, are very difficult to close again. What would you do if you were a pilot and saw something reaching for your aircraft from within a storm cloud? And if the hands of the disappeared continue to find ways to break through our world, what other messages might they be trying to deliver? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more investigations into aviation mysteries that the authorities don't want you to know about.